The following program is brought to you by Whiteman TV and Bruce Telecom. Hello, I'm Adam Olivero, and thank you very much for joining me for this special documentary, Resiliency and Recovery. We're talking about first responders' mental health this time and the things they can do to help with trauma. I want to give a special thank you to Leslie Ford, and we'll be talking to Lisa Leslie later on. They've sponsored the documentary, and we'll hear the reasons why, as Lisa mentions later on, why Leslie Ford felt it was so important to sponsor not only this documentary, but a previous documentary, and the 3 previous times they've sponsored the Invisible Wounds Conference as well. We are here at the Invisible Wounds Conference at the Best Western Hotel in Walkerton, and we're talking to some mental health professionals and first-line responder professionals about their mental health and trauma. We'll never get rid of trauma, as you'll hear in the documentary, but there are certainly lots of tools we have available now to cope with trauma in different ways and help people integrate and get back into life after having such traumatic events happen in their line of work. So I hope you enjoy the documentary, Resiliency and Recovery. Hi, I'm here now with Michael Clark, a former police officer and now an Anglican priest. And Michael, you've done a lot of work in your years as policing, right?
I've done a lot of work working with marginalized people, both as a police officer and on the street, working with street youth.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences there and working with the street youth?
Sure. I started with Peel Police when I was 26 in 1980, and my plan was only to stay 2 years. I had my degree in psychology and had been working with people and thought I was brilliant as a young twit, and I realized after a couple years of working, I knew nothing, and so I thought I was best place to learn about real life was on the police force. And the plan was only for 2 years. But it turned out that I was really good at it. Every time I sneezed, I caught a bad guy, so they kept promoting me. So I stayed through the 80s. I was a fraud detective and underwater search and recovery diver. Wow. And it was after that period that I began working with street kids. Right.
Can you tell us how the experience and the trauma doing that kind of work affected you as a person?
Yeah, so PTSD was a psychological diagnosis back then, but Peel Police and us up here in Canada knew very little about it. And I experienced all the trauma and horror that most big city police officers experience. In fact, the division I was working at in Peel when I started statistically was the busiest police station in Canada. Wow. And you booked on for a shift for 10 hours and you didn't have time for yourself at all. I think the pivotal experience for me was my locker partner was a beautiful young guy, 24 years old, and one Sunday morning got a call to come and take a report of a break and enter at some guy's apartment, but it was a psycho, and he had knives under all the pillows. And as soon as Dwayne walked in and turned his back, the guy killed him, shredded his body, over 50 stab wounds, and then took Dwayne's gun and shot himself. And I was the oldest on the shift. I was 30, and the 9 other guys, all young guys. So I was assigned to the morgue that night to maintain continuity of the bodies. So I spent 6 hours in the morgue by myself with my partner's dead body and the bad guy. All of us worked our shifts on the Monday. On the Tuesday, we were in the color guard for the funeral on Wednesday. I went to court on my day off on Thursday, started a shift 7 days of midnights on Friday, and the force did nothing. Wow. For any of us. So you can imagine the trauma that caused. Yeah. And if you track the lives of all 10 of us, every one of us, marriages broke up, including mine. One young guy started drinking and ended up in prison, OCI Correctional Institute for being drunk and killing two old ladies in a car accident going home from shift one night. So the trauma was pretty severe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's something where nowadays we would expect you to take time off. You didn't get any time off to
there was no time
take
off.
that situation in and cope with it.
No care for the guys. I don't know that it's got a lot better now. I mean, it's a little better, but I don't know that it's even a lot better now.
So in your research on PTSD and moral trauma, like what kind of things have you discovered that has affected your research and just in general?
There's a component to PTSD that was not really diagnosed until fairly recently, I think in the 90s, and it's called moral trauma. And what was happening was guys would be treated for post-traumatic stress through their first responder or military experience, and were getting good therapeutic training, and yet would still end up suiciding. Right. And so what they found is that most people that go into that kind of service have a high moral standard. They go because they feel called to help and to be a positive presence in society. And once they get into the work, I taught at Humber College in the police program for 14 years, and I taught a course, and I told them that within 3 months you're going to change with the things that you see.
Yeah.
And those changes can be as a result of the terror and stuff that you see, but also what you preconceived as how this world worked got totally mashed and totally destroyed once they get on the job. Yeah. So myself, I was raised in a strong Christian family, belief in God, which most of my compatriots have were raised with some kind of faith. But all of a sudden you're in an environment where it doesn't look like God has any control over anything, and your spirit gets wounded. That's what moral trauma is about, the wounding of your spirit.
Yeah. Yeah, wow. Yeah, absolutely. Like you said there, that you see a whole different world that's completely different from what you've been raised in and you're just thrown into this situation with some training, of course, from the police force, but nothing can prepare you for some of the things you see, I'm sure.
No, and what I've researched and found is that there's virtually no positive treatment for moral trauma that's being done. Right. And so I've started working on that. And a year ago this month, October, I started with two other fellows, a retired fire chief and a retired ex-PO cop. And we started a post-traumatic stress peer support group. And there are three components with each of the three things that the three of us have some expertise in. So the fire chief, Dave Connor, is really skilled in understanding the whole systems approach to WSIB and how you get care and treatment. Yep. Gary Ruby has all kinds of experience and expertise in addictions and what kind of programming you get for addictions. And then my part is dealing with helping guys with their moral trauma, kind of spiritual counseling and direction.
Right, and you've had a lot of successes with this program, I hear, too.
We have. We're saving lives. We got it's a weekly program at my church, and we've got over 40, close to 50 people that have come out. We usually have about 15 to 18 every Thursday night.
Right on, that's awesome.
We had a guy come in one night, fireman, and said, I've just been standing on the 407 bridge waiting for a truck to come by so I could jump in front. And he said, I realized I couldn't not kill the driver in terms of timing it, and I just wanted to kill me, so here I am. So he was with us for a pile of months, and he's doing very well.
Good, that's really good to hear.
Saved his life for sure.
Good.
God saved his life.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you talk about that? You said you grew up in a very Christian family, so was that a natural progression to you from transitioning from policing to then going into the ministry of an Anglican church?
I always felt a call to work with the most marginalized, and it wasn't really as a priest or a minister, but the years I spent on the streets, they were tough years. They were good years. They were powerfully educational and important for me, but I just got too old to work in the streets, so I got the collar. I've been a priest for about 17 years and try and train other people to be more accommodating and facilitating. For instance, for some of the first responders that come to my Thursday night group to come to church on Sunday mornings. Part of the healing for moral trauma is to re-engage with positive community And there's not a lot of environments out there that are all that positive in terms of community. So I've created myself and my parishioners have created a very safe environment, and a number of them attend and fully participate now in community, whereas before they were isolating and hiding.
Oh, that's so nice to hear,
Yeah.
that they're in there and they're participating. Because like you said, that's a big thing, that if they just shut down, that's not very good.
Right.
Then it's a very dangerous situation. But if they're out participating in your church community, that's a very big step and a good step to getting back into community.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your time and your stories.
Appreciate it.
I'm here now with Ann Pickering, and Ann, now I know you were invited to speak at the Invisible Wounds Conference as a survivor of a traumatic event, a house fire. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what happened during that house fire?
Sure. So the fire occurred in January 2016. So I was 19 years old at the time, and I was away at University of Windsor as a student. And I don't have any personal recollection of the events that night. It wouldn't be until about 6 weeks later when I woke up in hospital after being in a medically induced coma. And what I was told was that, while I was staying over at a friend's house, one of the people that lived there had actually set fire twice to a bag of garbage inside the home. And, fortunately, actually, the fire was discovered by someone. The second time they had to put it out, they'd actually hidden the bag behind a couch in the living room. And we don't actually know if that bag had smoldered and caused the fire, or if actually a third fire was set. They were never able to determine that, but I think it was a very severe fire, actually. The home was completely engulfed, and it took about 50 minutes for me to be recovered from the fire.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so my injuries were life-threatening, to say the least. Yeah, so I had a severe smoke inhalation injury, as well as burns to 20% of my body. So I was very grateful for the efforts of fire and police and EMS, as well as the team at Sunnybrook Hospital for really my survival. It was quite incredible. So when those injuries, became less of the focus, and I somewhat recovered from the physical aspect of the injuries, I then had to contend with more of the psychological wounds, and it would be some time, but I really did struggle quite a bit with anxiety and depression and symptoms related to post-traumatic stress.
Right.
Because, living through a traumatic event is one thing, but it's what happens inside of us after the fact that really does take the toll on a psychological and emotional level. So yeah, it would be some time before I was really able to move through that. And the other piece too was I was quite angry, especially after the person who had set the fires was actually acquitted for having, so it was like I said, a very difficult time, and it would be a very long time before I was able to move forward.
Wow, well, thank you for coming and sharing this story, first of all.
Yes, thanks.
So Ann, you were talking a lot about the emotional impact of this traumatic event, this fire, and then the recovery period after that. So what were some of the things that you did to help with that recovery period that helped you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think was really important was that I needed to decide how I wanted to spend the rest of my life. The anger and anxiety that I experienced, as well as these really negative beliefs that I had about myself, were really unhelpful. And, it took some time, but I really had to make a decision about whether or not I wanted to lead a life that was worth showing up for.
Right.
And then, sort of take the necessary steps in order to sort of create that life. And I was fortunate enough to be able to work with a psychotherapist that helped me process that loss. And I actually continue to work with the psychotherapist today. And, what we work together on is basically just the normal sort of stressors and strains of everyday life, but then also in my professional life as a social worker, recognizing that the work that I do working with people in trauma recovery, as well as in the hospital setting, can have a really significant impact on me. I also discovered mindfulness meditation. So mindfulness meditation is basically a set of psychological skills that is really about enhancing life. That's really about being open to and curious about all of the emotions and experiences that we have.
Right.
And like what it taught me was that you can become comfortable with uncomfortable emotional experiences, and that just because anxiety or sadness feels bad, it doesn't mean that it's bad. It's actually a normal, but it's difficult, Yeah. So the language around bad emotions versus difficult ones, I think was an important distinction for me. So the mindfulness meditation, the psychotherapy was huge, and really, like, I came to see this experience as a real opportunity, and most crises can be that way. And it's a strange truth, but the truth is, I feel like how terrible it was, but it really was a great teacher for me of how to love myself and accept myself. And in some ways, I don't know if I would have come to this point had this event not happened, but I don't know if I learned things the hard way or what, but anyhow, I really do feel like it's been an important thing for me to learn along my journey, and I continue to sort of use these skills every day to get through this interview as well.
Wow, right on. So that's a big thing then, because tomorrow when you're at the conference, you're going to be, not to put the pressure on you, you're going to be talking in front of hundreds of people, and that's about your experiences, but they're here to hear your experiences to help understand where you're coming from too, and your experience must help in your professional life, like you're saying with social worker. You can relate to some of these traumatic situations, having been through one yourself. You can directly relate to how they feel.
That's right. Yeah. And I hope I can be useful in that way, and that was part of what sort of led me into the profession of social work. So yeah, I hope my clients feel that way.
So having been through a traumatic fire, has your perspective changed on fire safety then? Now that unfortunately you've experienced this traumatic event, how has your perspective changed around fire safety then?
Yeah, quite a bit. So, there's no question for me just how reckless and irresponsible and preventable this fire was. It was very disappointing to learn that the owner of the home, this rental unit, this property, had actually not met the requirements with respect to fire code. And so it was quite disappointing to learn that perhaps my injuries might not have been so severe had those steps not been taken. And so for me, I really feel strongly about fire safety education and about oversight with respect to owners of rental units and commercial properties, and maybe too just sort of general sort of education, fire safety education for our youth. And I know that our fire departments and educators do a lot of great work in this way as well, but I just feel very strongly in my experience about that in particular. So yeah.
Yeah, so just those even can be those simple things like test your fire alarms monthly, that kind of thing. I find a lot of people don't do that, and it's something you should be doing out there, people. Test your alarms monthly.
Oh, exactly. Well, so many things, and I think as a student away at university, it was quite a shock to the community to hear that this had happened, and a lot of parents were quite frightened, and
absolutely.
And I think maybe even too for parents out there who are sending their beloved children off to school, maybe taking it a little bit one step further around, are things up to code? Is there the fire rated doors? Is there that 30-minute separation? What type of rental unit is it? And that makes a difference too in terms of what fire safety steps or requirements are needed. So I mean those things, I guess, Yeah.
Well, thank you, Anne, for sharing your story with us.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm here now with Sergeant Jennifer Noel from the London Police Service. And Jennifer, how has the stigma changed? You've been an officer for 18 years. How has that stigma changed in the 18 years you've been on the police force?
It's changed a lot recently. I think as I was coming into policing, it was starting to shift a little bit, where taking care of yourself, mental health was something that we started talking more openly about, but maybe not everyone. And it's changed now that it's something that everyone talks about, and it's becoming more and more part of our regular training. So whether you want to talk about it or not, it's happening, and then slowly it's becoming part of everyday conversations that you hear, right? And we're getting used to asking people if you think someone's having a bad day or that they were at some tough calls, checking in with them and asking them how they're doing. And we're even getting to the point where you ask people, do you know of someone that I might go talk to, right? Like a counselor, where someone might recommend someone just like they would recommend an optometrist or a dentist. So that's totally different. And that's mainly just in the last couple of years that I would say we've heard those conversations in the hallways where people are talking openly about that kind of thing. I think the Road to Mental Readiness training that we've done at London Police, and now all of the recruits at the Ontario Police College have that, has made a huge difference. Awesome. So that training talks about coping skills. It talks about how to identify when you might be struggling. So they use colors. So if you were to say you're in the red, that would be that things are going not well, like you are really struggling. We're in the green, right? Things are going really smooth, and life's the way it ideally would be. Yellow is maybe you're stuck at that train and you're frustrated, but you're going to bounce back from that. Orange is maybe where we're struggling a little more and we might need some help. So we hear people using that language, right? And they might just use it kind of off the cuff, like, oh, he's in the red, he needs some help. We need to talk to him. But the language it's part of our culture now. It's part of our language, which is great to see.
Yeah, absolutely. That's
so
awesome.
It's made the culture more accepting of the fact that things like post-traumatic stress and even just occupational stress injury. So, in regular language, to say that someone had some really bad calls, or maybe it's that their personal life has got some challenges and they're really struggling. So that we might check in with that person and offer them some assistance, whether it's chatting with a friend or going to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist or whatever that is. That has changed a lot.
Awesome. That's really good to hear. It's nice to hear when you're mentioning that they just have casual conversations in the hallway, and it's not centered around, got to get to this group meeting for whatever peer support. And those are important, of course, but it's nice that they're just having that casual conversation to get it out in the open right away, right? Yeah. Good. So what do you think caused that change then to be from where it was 18 years ago to today? Like, what do you think happened to make...
There's a few things that come to mind. There's some things that are really sad, and there's been a lot of suicides, right? And so those are our friends and our relatives that have tried to get through the struggles on their own without getting help, without talking about it, and they failed. Right. And that's horrible. It sucks, right? It sucks for them. It's for your coworkers, your friends. It's horrible. There's also officers I know that have left policing because of traumatic injuries, because of horrible things that have happened that they've experienced, and they went on to recover, and they've come back, and they are the ones that are saying, there's a better way.
Good.
Right?
Yeah.
There's a better way, and here's what it is. It's getting help. You can actually recover from this, right? So offering hope to people who might feel like there isn't any hope.
Right.
And then some other things in mainstream media. I don't actually have a TV or do much social media, but things like Bell Let's Talk Day. Right. Or seeing people who are like sportscasters or actors or whatever person that's popular in the media talking about their mental health struggles and then successes as well, right? And how that they cope with these things and they manage, and life isn't just as perfect as it seems, you know, on the screen, but that there's a struggle behind it and that you can cope. So offering that hope and resilience so that you can live with it and heal and move on and
Yeah, awesome. So what could you do if somebody's watching this documentary and they think maybe, and it may not even be in policing, but if they think maybe their friend is experiencing some kind of traumatic event or some trauma of some type, how do you recognize that? How could you help them? Like, what advice would you give?
Right, that's a great question. And I think it's something that people struggle with because they don't want to say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
They don't want to do the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And my answer to you is there is no wrong thing.
But
so
often they just do nothing, and
say,
that's the worst thing.
Say something,
Yeah.
really is the answer.
Right.
So, you know, it is awkward, right? It's awkward to reach out. It's awkward when you know the person. It's more awkward maybe when you don't know the person. But what if that person in your workplace doesn't have anyone that they're close to, right? Be that person. Reach out. And it might sound like, hey, you know, it's Jen calling. You know, I just noticed that you've been on a lot of, you know, really tough calls lately, and that must be really hard. How are you doing? You know, or I just noticed how are things? You seem a little off lately.
Yeah.
How are things going? Do you want to grab a coffee sometime? And the first time that you have that conversation with someone, and you'll be so nervous to do it, when they say, "Yeah, things have been really hard. Thanks for asking," it makes you want to do it again. Right? And it makes you feel really good. And sometimes, you know, that's all people need is just for someone, it makes such a huge impact for someone to recognize that you're going through a struggle, and it really helps to ease the burden, right? It's like we're there to share if you tell me about your problems, I'm going to take some of it from you and carry it myself. And it makes the load lighter. And it just helps you realize you're not alone. So, you know, if someone is struggling, and maybe it means helping them find some professional help, but sometimes it just means saying, can I come over and bring a coffee and just hang out? And maybe it's not talking about whatever the incident is, but it's just being with someone and being a friend, and so that they're not alone when they're going through that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to do it. Yeah, like you said, they don't need to necessarily get over for that coffee and be like, all right, so tell me about this. What happened? They could just have the coffee and be like, how's life?
Yeah, you know, I hope it doesn't upset you that I'm asking about it, but I just want you to know that I care, right?
Yeah.
Or if we see people coming back from being off in the workplace, I think people struggle with, well, why was that person, you know, maybe there's rumors, why were they off, we're not sure. Well, just when you see them, say welcome back. It's great to have you back. We missed you. Or if that person's off, just send them a text, right? Just thinking of you. I know some bosses worry about, well, I'm not allowed to ask why someone. I think of it as checking in, not checking up. Right? Not checking up on you, but I'm checking in with you as a friend, as someone who cares.
Yeah.
I just want you to know that we're thinking about you. We hope everything's going well for you. If there's anything we can do, or if you ever need an ear, we're here for you.
Yeah.
Like, how great would that feel
Yeah,
if you were the person that needed to take some time off? How much, like, I'm sure people must feel like, oh, I wonder what everyone's thinking. And just to get that little reach out of support must go a long way for folks.
I'm sure it does.
So it's simple. Keep it simple. Just, what would your grandma do? Right?
That's a good way to
She'd
think
bake
of it.
something and she'd take it over.
Bake something, take it over, bring a coffee and be like, here, just have a cookie.
That's right. Cookie makes everything better.
Yep.
Yeah.
So do you think then that just trauma that we've all been talking about, do you think that's preventable, or can you reduce it in some way, or what do you think?
Right. Another good question. So I don't think trauma is preventable at all, right? In this job as a police officer, part of what we have to do in society is deal with traumas. We can't control what we're going to see, right? We go to deaths, we go to car accidents, we see children that aren't well cared for. There's things that break our hearts, and sometimes it's people we know or that remind us of people we know. So there's going to be trauma. But taking care of ourselves and recognizing that trauma affects us, and that we're not bulletproof, and that we can't just have these things happen to us and go on and not deal with it.
Yeah.
I think that better prepares us to handle it when it does happen, right? So we know that, wow, I've had this really traumatic incident, whether it's one or whether it's many incidents that just build up, then we know, you know what, I need to take care of myself.
Right.
And what does that look like, right? So it means getting the tools in your toolbox. So things like this seminar, right? Things like the training we do in our workplace. So knowing that, wow, when I'm in that traumatic incident, I remember we did lots of training on breathing. Right? So it may sound silly, but I'm going to try it. Wow, it does. It calms you down, right? Mindfulness, right? When you're in that moment, okay, well, what do I hear? What do I smell? What do I see? Like just those little things to ground you, to bring you back. Yeah. And then how do I take care of myself afterwards? Like if we think of it like a physical injury, if you twisted your ankle, and you just thought, well, I'm not going to deal with that. And you just kept,
a little weird.
I just kept going to CrossFit. I just kept like doing my thing, like obviously injured. It's never going to get better.
Yeah, for sure.
Right?
Yeah.
If you have a traumatic injury at work, then it's not going to get better if you don't, you might be able to like mask it,
right.
Pretend it's not there, but why not just heal it? We have all of these wonderful things available to us, right?
Yeah.
So another thing about how things have changed is counseling is so much more accessible.
Oh, good.
We have, our benefits are way better, right? It's way more accessible in the workplace. If you need to go to an appointment, then we will make time for you to go to your appointment. We have a list of folks that you can go see. We have Homewood, I see that's here, and that's who we use for our employee assistance plan, and they're awesome. And you can call someone for free and talk right now, so it's very accessible.
Right.
And we expect you. You're as a supervisor, I'm going to say to you, wow, that was a hard call, right? I really think you should talk to someone. Here's my suggestion.
Yeah.
And what's changed is when people say, well, I don't know about that. I don't think that's for me. If I can then say, well, here's who I've been to see, right? And I found it really helpful. Oh, wow. We start to share our experiences and people, and you can see the switch, right? You can see people go, oh, okay. Well, if you do it, well, then that's different.
Yeah, because you're my supervisor and you do it, so that makes it kind of
So that's really one of the biggest changes that I've seen personally is people sharing their individual stories. And that, to me, is the single most impactful thing you'll see that makes a positive change is when someone is willing to be vulnerable and share their own story. Because you can be at the front of a class teaching about something and people are going to hear it, but when you share your own experience, they're going to experience that with you, and that's going to be very impactful, and they're going to remember that. And a lot of folks are going to go out and act on that and follow up with it.
Yeah, for sure. That I think has been one of the big things too. Yeah, hearing the direct stories of this is what I experienced, and I'm here today. Right. Yeah, that's huge. Good. So then what are the benefits of attending a conference such as the Invisble Wounds that you're at this time?
Well, so that leads perfectly into that question, because that's one of the main draws to a conference like this is you've got folks that are sharing their personal story.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's impactful to us, and it's also impactful, maybe, it might be a year from now when I'm talking to someone as a member of our peer support team to say, you know what, this reminds me of a story that someone shared with us at a conference, and they went through something similar. Mm-hmm. Just to know that there's other folks out there that are having these experiences, right. And that they have struggles, but also that they can have resiliency and they can work through them, and that there's hope at the end of it, and that you can get through that, maybe as a spouse of someone who's going through this. And whether it's a firefighter or any of the emergency services, to know that, this does affect other people. Yeah. It's not just me. So that's why we need to reduce the stigma, right? Because otherwise people feel alone, and
yeah, absolutely.
You feel alone. You don't want to talk about it. But when everyone's saying no, this is just part of it, right? This is part of the experience, and this is how you recover from that. And we're here to help. And these awesome people share their stories, which is very brave of them to do that in a big room. And then I love also hearing from some of the folks that provide services and support, because you learn about different techniques and you learn about what's out there, and whatever works for me may not work for you. And there's so many different types of counseling and therapy and mindfulness and meditation and retreats. So there's all kinds of wonderful things that can be helpful, and they're not all for everyone, but it's nice to come here and hear about what's new, what's available in your community, who are the people that are doing the training, and who might you reach out to if there was something that you were interested in learning more about or connecting with folks that presented here.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to put it. And then go back to take your ankle injury, if you twist your ankle in real life, and then you continue to do CrossFit, that ankle's not going to heal the same way. So you need to take that time to slow down and heal the trauma.
You need to go do your physiotherapy. That's what I'm thinking, right? And just like physiotherapy, it may not feel like after 1 or 2 appointments, right? My ankle's not better. Well, it's the same, right? When you have a traumatic injury, like you may not be cured after, right? And you may not ever be the same as you were before, but doing nothing is not going to make you better either.
No, for
so go and try it. And it's probably covered by your benefit. So use it. What do you have to lose, right? You have everything to gain and nothing to lose. So
absolutely.
I really want to encourage people to go out and just try seeking some assistance if you think you could benefit from that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing your stories, Jennifer.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hi, I'm here now with Lisa Leslie from Leslie Motors. And Lisa, this documentary and one previously we did, and you've also been a sponsor of the Invisible Wounds Conference too. Why does Leslie Ford feel so involved in sponsoring these documentaries around mental health?
Well, we're very fortunate that we actually have staff members who volunteer their time as firemen and in different roles, and we feel it's important to support them and not only the community we live in, but also their endeavors and the things that they are doing to help our community.
Yeah, well, we thank you, because with these documentaries, we're trying to break down that stigma, right? Which is a humongous thing to get out there. And of course, that probably goes back to your staff, like you said, being on the fire department, if you can help them even talk casually in your own environment about it, right?
For sure, yeah. And I mean, I'm sure it's not easy for them when they come back from a fire call or an ambulance call, and then I'm expecting them to focus back on work, and they've just been dealt something very very traumatic, and none of us can relate to that, right? So it's important to recognize what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Lisa, for sponsoring this, and thank you to Leslie Ford.
Terrific, thank you.
Here now with the Deputy Chief of Police for the Hanover Police Service, George Hebblethwaite. And George, you've been a police officer for how long then?
A little more than 35 years.
Right, so in that time, can you talk a little bit about these invisible wounds, PTSDs, disorders that you've seen over that amount of time?
Yeah, it's quite the overview and experience that a lot of senior officers have, going back to the day when these things weren't discussed.
Right.
I mean, we're all human, and the nature of police work is, of course, that you end up dealing with the negative or the dark side of humanity in many respects. And in the early days, I'm talking 25, 30 years ago, if you're dealing with a sudden death or a serious car crash where people have been injured or killed, you just did your job, and most of us at the time, nothing really impacted you because you had things to do, you were focused on what needed to be done at the time.
Yeah.
But I know personally, it was that night or the next day or the day after, suddenly you're starting to think of the emotional piece for the family maybe that survived, or reliving what you've experienced, because in many respects, especially early in a career, it's the first time for a lot of things, and you really don't know what to expect.
Right.
And the emotions that are generated from that kind of situation in the early stages back in my day, you really didn't talk about the emotional impact on yourself. It was a suck it up attitude, rough, tough, you're not supposed to be feeling, especially when it came to the men. Of course, that's the old traditional bad way of looking at it, but in the day, that's what it was. Men are supposed to be tough, you can't cry, you can't show emotion.
And so it was like, just deal with it however you want to deal with it, but get back out there because you got a job to do, right?
In some cases, that was almost the exact words that you would hear.
Wow.
And I think it's difficult to understand why, but there wasn't the indication, at least outwardly, on the people that I worked with, and I worked in a number of different locations, there wasn't the outward appearance of issues like I've seen in the recent 10 to 15 years. I don't know how to explain that part of it. I'm not a clinical person, but I've lived these experiences. But I do know that we've gone from what used to be, in hindsight, an intolerable approach to these situations,
Right.
to something where it's recognized, and rightfully so. And we've ended up in the last number of years where after major motor vehicle collisions or after a major event such potentially as a house fire, where persons have been seriously hurt or killed, or any traumatic incident like that, there's an awareness that there needs to be discussions about how are you feeling?
Right.
What is your mind telling you besides your heart, or vice versa? Let's talk about it. And there's nothing wrong in doing that. And a lot of times, particularly for younger officers who are just seeing these things for the first time, there's an emotional release that happens. And I suspect in hindsight, had that been done in earlier times, there may not have been this buildup of the dark side of things that results and leads to, or can lead to, a PTSD situation.
Or worse.
Or worse, yeah, or worse. I mean, I unfortunately have known officers that have taken their lives.
Yeah.
And knowing the things that they've done and seen, like most officers, I know personally, I've gone, but for the grace of God go I.
Right.
For whatever reason, I've experienced very similar things or the exact same things, and I've managed to maintain my sanity, or at least
Good.
people think I've maintained my sanity, but I've gotten through it.
Yeah.
And it's a combination, I think, of being able to somehow compartmentalize these things and also discuss it. I mean, you need to vent these things.
Right.
And part of the problem, I suspect, too, with policing, and for that matter, all your first responders, is that you have this oath of secrecy and the privacy aspects of your work. So what ends up happening, of course, if you want to talk about things that you've experienced, then you end up talking with your colleagues as opposed to other persons with different different outlook
Yes, yeah.
or different experiences that can help broaden how you're looking at something. So when you keep talking to the same group of people, because legally you're allowed to, we're all sworn to an oath, so we have the same lived experience, and then we all talk amongst each other, and without getting outside of that group and starting to focus on the better things, the experience I've had is that you tend to sometimes get too narrow in your view of the negative aspects
Right.
of society in general, and that can only lead to snowball effect as to how you view life in general.
Yeah.
And if you're only seeing the bad side and you're only living and working amongst those that dealing with the same type of negative issues, then it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy where you have a negative outlook on life. So personally, there were times in my career where I know for a fact that I was in a bad way emotionally. And I might be digressing here a bit, but I'll go back to 1993. It was a very bad year. I was with the OPP at the time. I was a supervisor.
Right.
And there were 3 supervisors and a detachment commander. 2 of the supervisors, one had retired, but they hadn't filled his spot yet. The detachment commander was off on sick leave. Another supervisor, frontline supervisor, was off on sick leave.
Wow.
So, back up. One of the 3 supervisors sat in for the detachment commander, which left me the only operational road supervisor.
Wow. Oh, because you had a lot of people to cover.
Yeah, we had a lot of people to cover, but a lot of areas. And this was in the
Yeah.
Kitchener, Waterloo region area.
Okay.
And that 1993 was a particularly crazy year for serious collisions. We had 15 fatal collisions that year up until August. And I was at 13 of them, and we had 21 killed.
Oh my gosh.
So
Yeah,
we had-
very difficult year.
We had triple fatalities, with 2 of them within 3 days in July that year. One of them involved Waterloo Regional Police officer's son.
Oh.
Just devastating
Yeah,
in many respects.
Yeah.
Any death is tragic, but I found myself getting very dark and being called. I was on call, and I would get called at home. We've got another bad crash. And in behind my eyeballs, I'm thinking, please, this has got to stop.
Yeah.
No more. You don't pay me enough for this. So I know the one crash, I don't want to get too graphic here, but the one crash that happened on the Labor Day weekend of '93 happened on Highway 85 near Elmira.
Right.
and a motor vehicle coming towards Kitchener. It was in a sweeping curve to its right. It just went over the center line and tapped the back corner of a car going the other way. And what that did was spun the car off the shoulder and across the highway broadside, and the next vehicle broadsided this car. And there was 2 occupants, a husband and a wife. The husband was driving, the wife was in the passenger seat, and because of the nature of the collision, she was trapped in the car. The crush over damage and the fuel line was exposed because of that's where they ran on the passenger side in the frame, and a fire engulfed the car. And the woman was conscious and her husband couldn't get her out. He got out, and we arrived on scene probably within 15-20 minutes, and there was absolutely nothing that could be done.
Oh, that's hard.
It was one of the worst I'd had to deal with. And the woman, you could almost see her home from where the accident was in the village of St. Jacobs. Yeah, so that was almost the last straw mentally and emotionally for me. But as Providence would have, I was slated to go on a 6-week tactical training course at the Army base in Meaford, starting on the Monday. So I was a day late getting there because of all that was entailed with this investigation. I was supervising it. But when I got to this training course for 6 weeks, I didn't have road responsibilities. I was involved in strictly Monday to Friday, a lot of physical work done, highly physical activity, and classroom work, and it was totally detached from regular police work.
Right, so like luck of the draw, faith.
Timing was excellent,
you
because
say,
I was
timing's
probably,
perfect, yeah.
in hindsight, I was probably on the verge of a breakdown based on all that type of information. If I didn't have that break, I suspect I would have been in a bad way at that time. And it's just one of those ups and downs in policing, and all first responders will say the same thing. You have those dark periods, and you have those hopefully positives that are positive, those periods that are positive. But that was in 1993. I'll never forget that year because of that contrast. That leading up to that 6-week break and then coming back from that break feeling better about everything and recognizing good things as well as the bad things, as opposed to focusing in on the negative things.
Absolutely.
And interestingly, it was in and around that time that police services in general, and the OPP specifically, started developing incident stress and traumatic stress teams and serious incident response teams to go out and discuss if there was serious injury to a member on duty. The co-workers and the member themselves, they'd be spoken with and debriefed, which wasn't a common thing prior to that. And it's the debriefing and talking about what's going through your mind and how you're feeling and what the sensations are that you're going through, and being able to openly discuss that really helps. And if you can't release it, then of course it builds up. And at some point, anyone is going to crack.
And they get that first call where the people are in extreme stress and distress.
Whereas we're not on the other end. So they actually, in some respects, it hits them harder, faster.
For sure, I could see that.
But that change in the legislation, the presumptive change, means that when a first responder is diagnosed with PTSD or a similar affliction, it's presumed to be as a result of work. Whereas prior to that, and unfortunately I've had experience with this too, one of the officers in my detachment, he happy-go-lucky for years. And then in the last year leading up to when he went off on PTSD, very noticeable change in his demeanor, a little less open, a little more negative. And it was to the point where finally people started saying, what's wrong? And it just started the process to where he ended up going off on emotional issues. He applied for compensation. It was denied. And so that was in the day before presumption. But he appealed that. So during the course of the investigation that resulted in him being allowed to claim compensation, I sat with him and his wife and a workplace safety investigator. And we spent 3 hours discussing the events that may have led to his current situation. And the member was talking very flat on some things that would make you cringe, but he was very flat about it emotionally, very impacted by the same things that all first responders do and see and have to carry with them. But he was one of those unlucky souls who, for whatever reasons, again, but for the grace of God go I,
Yeah.
it hurt him.
Right.
And I remember leaving that interview feeling so bad for him, but thankful that the investigator wasn't there to deny him. He was there to find reasons to support his claim.
Oh.
And in fact, it worked out that way.
Good.
So he's still not back to work yet, but he's in a heck of a better place. In fact, I've been conversing with him back and forth recently. He's in a heck of a better place than what he was a number of years ago.
Good.
That he wouldn't have been without the support that he got.
Good.
There's no shame in that.
No, absolutely. I think that's a great spot to end it, George. It's just that they need to know that people are there on the receiving end to receive that word and talk about it, right?
Yeah.
But there's no shame in talking about it. So thank you very much for sharing this, George.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm here now with Andy MacDonald, a retired fire chief, and now with Homewood Health. And Andy, we've been talking a lot about mental health and the stigmas around it. What do you think has been the biggest stigma getting in the way of eradicating the occupational stresses that first responders face?
I think a lot of it, if I can speak to the fire world first, is it's tradition.
Right.
The saying is the fire business is 200 years of tradition unimpeded by progress, and we've always done everything the same way. Well, things are changing and evolving quickly, and I hope this does as well, but it's that tough persona that we put on, and that goes across the first responder world.
Yeah.
A lot of that are the walls you build up to deal with the operational stress that you see on the job. Those same walls prevent you from sharing the information and talking to people and admitting that it hurts.
Right.
And it's okay to hurt, but we've built that tough skin, and it's the same tough skin that the industry's used to, or we use to protect ourselves, also prevents us from opening up and talking to people when we really should.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it also leads, or part of the stigma is not wanting to appear weak.
Right.
And to speak to fire again, it's a team sport. I mean, it's a unit, and you're only as strong as the weakest link. And wrongly so, for generations, I think we've thought that if anybody shows any sign of weakness, it negatively impacts the team. So that's part of the stigma. You know, we were told, toughen up, suck it up.
So by that point, nobody wants to show any weakness.
Yes. And that's historically, that's why the stigma exists.
Right.
And we really need to change that. People need to know it's okay to hurt.
Yeah, so is that one of the ways? Like how do we get past that then?
I think it's a multi-pronged thing. This helps. I know I've been in this business for 41 years, and for decades we didn't talk about it at all. Most people. I had the benefit of a brilliant mother who did share a story with me that had me thinking about it my whole career, but we're starting to now. I don't know how many people in the public even heard the term PTSD 10 years ago, but now it's part of our consciousness. We're talking about it. Things like the Invictus Games, where the athletes suffering PTSD compete side by side with someone who may have lost a limb to a roadside bomb, and the acknowledgement that it's an injury. So it's part now of the public consciousness, and as it becomes accepted by the public, I think it's more accepted by the first responders. You're not weak if you have a call that has a negative impact on you. So the approach will be to continue that conversation, to have conferences like this, to share it with the public so they don't put our first responders up on pedestals and see us as perfect and bulletproof. And it's okay to hurt. It's okay, for the public to think it, for us to think it as well. Then there's education for the public and for our firefighters through conferences, through recruit training, and all different kinds of levels. We really need to just keep talking. That's the key.
Good. Now that's what we're doing here. Excellent. Yes. So then how could, in a firefighting perspective, how could a senior officer help the officers below them in the unit to eradicate this, to get that barrier taken down?
They can't put themselves on a pedestal.
Right.
And it's it's an interesting dilemma, because in a paramilitary organization like police or fire, senior officers have to be obeyed. That's what keeps you safe.
Yeah.
That experience and education of a senior officer, we follow them, not blindly, but follow them and do everything they say.
Yeah.
So you have to, I think there's sometimes a feeling that even more than anyone else in the team, you have to be extremely strong for them to follow you. Well, I think the more enlightened senior officers understand that if you want people to follow you, they need to follow all of your actions. And it's okay to admit that this job hurts. And there's times when even a senior officer has to sit and chat with his team and tell the gals and guys that, share stories about times where it hurt.
Right.
And when the team is hurting with a loss of a team member or a sudden injury or something, it's okay to sit and talk about that aspect of it.
Right.
You just can't walk in your uniform and sit there and pretend that it's not bothering you. If it's not bothering you, you shouldn't be there.
Right.
And it's okay to share that. I had very unfortunate circumstance in my last year as chief. Had one of the members of my department committed suicide, and I went and shared my feelings with the crew. It was the captain, and I think it was important. And sometime later, a couple of them said that to me, that they saw the strength in the fact that I was able to come and sit with them and talk to them, and we talked out how they were feeling and gave them options for help and certainly encouraged them to continue the conversation. You can't sit in an office and think that I have to look like this isn't bothering me. That's the wrong message to send. You can be strong and be a great officer and still be human.
Good. That's awesome. So leading through actions. What they always say, good leaders lead through action.
Yes.
So that's just another action.
Just run through the breach.
Right.
It's you've got to be real.
Right.
You want people to be like you, then they have to see that it's okay for them to talk about it.
Absolutely. Good.
And I encouraged my team members, my department, to share conversations with their families as well. Now that doesn't mean that they go home and tell the families the terrible things they've seen.
In descriptive detail,
Which is likely the worst thing to do.
Yeah.
But it's okay to say they had a rough day.
Right.
It was a rough day. And
I had a bad accident today. It was pretty rough.
I need a few moments alone. Or why don't we go for a walk?
Right.
Like let's do something. Let's go play ball. Let's do something, because that's a great way to spend time. One of the keys to resilient first responder is to have healthy relationships. So don't go home and keep it to yourself and skulk off to the basement and open a bottle. Do something with your family. Have a fulfilling activity that makes you feel good about who you are and what you do in your family and your relationship. That's what you do. And it's okay to share with them that this is a tough job. I encourage all first responder departments with new recruits to share information with the family. Now, it doesn't mean you sit down and tell the family this is what they're going to see on the job, but this is a tough job, and you can be very, very proud of your mom or your dad or your brother, your sister, your son, or your daughter. But understand this job also comes with its challenges. So not every day is going to be a lot of fun for them. Just be there when they get home.
Yeah.
Give them a hug. Go out and play ball. Go for a drive. Go for a walk. Maintain a happy and healthy personal relationship. Is going to make you have a healthier and happier relationship at work.
So is that really the key to future generations, to have long and healthy careers, is to have those conversations, have good relationships?
Yes.
And one of the big keys?
I think the key is eyes open going into the profession.
Right.
Anyone, whether it's first responder, emergency room worker, correctional service, these jobs along this line of work that have these operational stresses, go into it with your eyes open.
Yeah.
And part of that is, again, to educating the public. We know now that people suffer injuries, mental injuries on the job. Mm-hmm. It's not like it is on television. Although even to their credit, some of the first responder or emergency services television shows are starting to address it, some of the mental health things. So people see that's what it is. Going in, it's going to be tough. Resilience can be taught. The popular thinking in science is showing us today that you can teach resilience.
Good.
Provide resilience training to new recruits in recruit school upon graduation. The same as you do on the fire department, the same as you do ladder drills every year so they can practice putting up a ladder. Sit and talk about mental health and about operational stress and about good diet and sleep and exercise and healthy relationships, all the keys to a healthy and happy long career. And encourage people when they encounter a bad call or an accumulation of bad calls to reach out for the help that's there, whether it's peer support or EFAP. Make it the same as if you break your arm. You don't hesitate to go to emerge.
Absolutely.
When you're suffering mentally and something hurts, get help for it.
Yeah.
Doesn't make you weak. It makes you human, and it's healthy, it's recuperative, but it's also preventative.
Yeah, in some of our other interviews tonight, we've used that analogy where if you had like a twisted ankle or a broken arm, you would go get it fixed. But you wouldn't think to, go play around of baseball with a broken arm. Well, you shouldn't think about going to play a round of, well, maybe baseball might be a good one, but you shouldn't think of going back to work if you have a mental health condition. Yeah. Right away, seek some treatment.
Exactly. And today, there are a number of options, and the help's there.
Good.
And we want to make it as easy as possible.
Good. So that'd be my next question then, is today and into the future, what does that hold? Like, what are the options that are going to be available in the future?
We're growing through this paradigm shift right now. We're talking about it more and more. Conferences like this didn't exist a few years ago. Now it does. I think there's it's not going to happen overnight. We've got some growing to do. These careers are 30-year careers quite often, so it's not as if we can change everything today. The current cohort of first responders have anywhere from 0 to 30 years already on the job and 30 years of experiences. So the way we help them is different than the way we prepare the up-and-coming first responders. Sure. But I think the future looks bright because we are talking about it. We've got conferences like this. We've got a lot of research being done on the topic, which is great, and sort of pairing some of the work that the military are doing and the first responder communities are doing. Right. There's some fascinating new research that I'm involved in helping put the players together on using virtual reality for exposure resilience training. I've had a chance to do it. They're doing some amazing work at Humber College, and that encourages me to see that this is available, that we can give students in their program a chance to encounter some of this stuff on the job with biofeedback, and so they can learn to recognize the signs. Stuff that, boy, I sure didn't have when I started on the job, and we didn't have in place just a few short years ago. So I think the more people we get on board, the more we make it part of the everyday conversation and develop new means of education that effectively teach people how to cope. The future looks bright.
Excellent. Good.
I think the next generation of first responders are going to have tools at their disposal that we never had, and I hope they take advantage of it.
Excellent. Good. Well, thank you very much for sharing that, Andy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Here now with Nick Halmsey, founder of After the Call. And Nick, you've got a wonderful organization going. And if we could start, I wanted to talk about where we are in regards to mental health and first responders today.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously making strides. You and I are talking, so that's a big deal. We're at a conference, then that's a big deal. So we're having conversations. I think that my sticking point, when I founded After the Call, it really was a mental health or a mental wellness site, not a PTSD focus. And I think that that's the one thing that we might be mistaking. Of course, I'm not saying that it's not serious, and I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I mean, obviously it does, right? But I think that what happens is too often the rest of the mental health that we can experience through, if we want to call them OSIs or at least the stress that we're experiencing, we look at those as kind of secondary. And sometimes we say, and I mean even provincially with only having coverage for one diagnosis, we look and say, just anxiety or just depression or just these things, well, that's not good enough. And so I think, where we are is we're making strides, we're definitely breaking barriers, but still lots of work to do in getting a full kind of holistic look at mental health in the first responder world. And right now we're kind of stuck with either waiting for a PTSD diagnosis, which I think that, you know, a lot of folks who haven't been through the process don't fully understand. Yeah. Or we are forced with taking, you know, your anxiety or your depression and making it therefore symptoms of PTSD so that you can get the coverage, right? Like, it's an unfortunate thing that we can't just get mental health coverage across the gamut. So I think, you know, even from a year ago, I think we're still making progress. I mean, I think just saw something before coming in out east. They're starting to do PTSD coverage for the folks. You know, that surprises me that we're still having those conversations, right? I think that regardless, a place to start is a place to start, and just now picking that up is kind of astounding.
Right. Well, where do we go from here? Like, there are things happening in the province of Ontario where they're getting workplace acts updated soon, very soon, for including PTSD as part of it. That's a good starting point, and then we're moving forward from there?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hope. The hope is to move forward. I think that what happens is if we stay focused and uni-focused, and I've had this experience too in my work with Out of the Call and my private work, is that folks are, you know, kind of demanding the diagnosis. Okay. And that takes away from others that are struggling with it, right? We're making them secondary, and so it becomes, I think, problematic to them, and to me as a clinician, to have someone come up to me, obviously struggling, obviously needing support, and saying it needs to be this, right? I need you to help me get a diagnosis, because obviously I can't diagnose, but of this, you know, I've had multiple times I've gone through it and not received that diagnosis, and I get it. I mean, if we're telling you that that's the only thing that we'll cover and talk about, then that, you know, what else do we do but seek that support out when we need support?
Right, yeah. That's
so I don't fault anybody for doing it, right? Like, I mean, whatever you need to do to get the help at a frontline level, you do it.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. So where do you see as important within the firefighting culture as with mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably pieces of this that would apply to, you know, all of the different cultures, including dispatch and corrections in those, but that's my alma mater, so that's what I'll speak of.
Yeah, I should mention that.
Yeah. So one of the things I think the biggest mistake I made when I was first starting after the call stuff was the attack on the culture. Okay. Obviously things need to change, I'm not saying that, but there was this piece where, you know, we looked at the way the first responder, the firefighter, interacts with a call. And so you hear things like compartmentalization or compression of emotion. And as a clinician, I mean, that's a red flag. We shouldn't be doing those things, right? Those things that usually cause other things. And I'm turning around on that because I think that there's something about that culture that is necessary. The problem that we see is that we are not adding to it. So to run a call, if I'm running a really serious or traumatic call, whether that's a medical call or a structure fire or something like that, I can't be emotional in that moment, right? Yeah. Like, it's really difficult for me to sit with a really tragic grief response or you know, a worry or anxiety and then run my protocols. Right. Which is why we practice, which we go into autopilot. I mean, this is, again, a function even of trauma, right, is to be stuck in that moment. And so what happens there afterwards, though, is the missing piece, and this is the cultural piece. So I think if we lighten up on the compartmentalization, but we add that then you need decompression. Yeah. Right? So when we talk about emotions, just broadly speaking, we always say that we try to bury them. Right? And this is what addictions is about, or across the gamut. This is what all maladaptive coping is, right? I'm just trying to bury it, right? Yeah. And I always joke with people, what's the only other thing that you bury? Humans, right? Yeah. And in certain sci-fi films, in certain places, even they come back, right? So nothing stays buried, even those things, right? So the idea is, if we're compressing our emotion, we're going to start to feel that somewhere else. Right. We have research showing this. I think that there's some prospective studies showing that undiagnosed and untreated trauma, work, and stress can lead to things like cancer and fibromyalgia, right? So this is super chronic pain thing, right? I mean, it's all preliminary, but I think it makes a lot of good sense. Because if you think about, you know, you have a tough day at work, right? So say you wake up and you get in a spat with your partner, and then you go to work and it's a tough day. And then, you know, you get an fender bender on the way home, and then, you know, you find something else, right? At the end of the day, you could find a stain on your shirt, and you're reacting
Right.
from the compounds of all of that stress.
Yeah.
And that's our cumulative stress, right? And so we talk about it, but we don't, I think, really focus in on what that means.
Right.
And so when I'm talking to folks, and I say, listen, the work that you and I are going to do together is we're going to decompress that emotion, which sucks.
Yeah, it's going to be hurtful.
Yes,
but
right?
We're going to get through it.
Yeah, and I think a really common saying in the therapy world that's, really, I think, speaks volumes is,
pain
pain equals pain. But pain plus non-acknowledgement, that's suffering.
Right,
And
okay.
that's what we're trying to relieve, right?
Yeah. Good. Yeah, that's great. And like you were saying, I am really interested in that research about fibromyalgia being possibly a symptom of the stress. You could see that because your mental health, it does take a physical impact. You may not see it visually, but in your brain, things probably do change. And we're just on the cusp of learning about those things, right?
And I think we have certain approaches too that suggest that the connection, if we look at to the experts, the gurus, right? The Body Keeps Score is a big famous book that kind of shows that that's the mind and the body are connected. But even an approach that, kind of is really pushed on the first responders is EMDR, right? So eye movement desensitization, and the R I'm forgetting, right?
Okay.
Reprocessing.
Okay.
So the idea is that you're moving your eyes, and that's doing something in your brain as you relive the trauma, right? So you're using a physical process to help with a mental process, right? And you're doing that with a therapist, so that there's some work there as well. But I think our approach is we look at really proactive interventions for first responders, like yoga, for instance, is a body-based movement to help relieve stress. So I think that we have the indicators there. The research is always slower than the anecdotes, but that's what it's pointing towards, and I think that that's the exciting stuff. But that's also kind of going back to my first point, means that we should be getting it right.
Yeah, for sure.
And so to get it right means that if I'm dealing with cumulative stress stuff, then I need to be able to treat anxiety and treat depression separate than treating a full PTSD diagnosis, or should be able to treat acute stress disorder, which we don't talk about, or we should be able to we should be able to, as a first responder, go to a call. It may bug us. We should be able to walk through some doors and get some support, regardless of the diagnosis.
Right, yeah. And is that where things like peer support groups and stuff help too?
I think it definitely can, right? The peer support and CISM and things like those things, they're not clinical interventions either, right? And so we have to be careful with what we suggest that they do, and so we're going down the peer support. I think that the unpopular view is if we look at meta-analysis, so the big study of studies, and we look at what peer support does, it does some great things, but it doesn't do things like prevent you coming to the hospital for symptoms, for instance, or it doesn't improve, or of course anecdotally we'll find this, but it doesn't show to prove over the studies a lessening of symptoms, right? But it gives you hope, and it gives you empowerment, and it gives you community, and it gives you all of these other things, and normalization. Your secrets become your bond in those groups, and that's a powerful thing. And we don't throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater, but having real conversations with it is going to help us look and maybe even fix those pieces. Like, what about clinical work? Can we adopt into a peer support group, right? We don't need our peers to be clinicians, right? But what can we adopt in there to make those other pieces that are really, really important to folks coming through the doors and really looking to peer support to do, and make that an effective approach for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just one part of the whole overall
tool for the toolkit.
Yeah, for sure. What's the largest barrier to progress for first responder organizations, do you think? Is that one thing we were just been talking about there?
Yeah, bang on. So I think that the one thing that, I think that the biggest thing that I notice when I'm talking to organizations or talking to people a part of organizations is usually more of the case, right? Is that we have different titrations, and people do it good. I think that there's a lot of organizations that are doing really good work. But across the board, what we find is I'm going to subscribe to one approach.
Okay.
Right? So, organization A is saying, we're going to do peer work.
Yeah.
Right. Organization B says we're going to do CISM work, right? So critical stress management work. B says we're going to do R2MR, so the road to mental readiness. And so, But the problem with that is, and I'm stealing this, so I got to give him credit, right? Comes from a conversation I had with Stefan Granier. He said, we're giving everybody the same medicine.
Yeah. And medicine needs to be different for everybody.
Yes, right? Like it's the analogy runs deep.
Yeah.
And I think what happens though is organizations don't know what to do. And my biggest criticism, and this won't change, I don't think, and I'm not going to get in a lot of trouble for saying this because I think anybody that's in it knows this, right, is our one downfall is how reactive we are.
Okay.
So if you are in trouble, the organizations, if you're a part of one of those different groups, is going to band around you and support you, right?
Right.
But we're reactive in it. So what that means is we wait till the worst case scenario happens.
Gotcha.
You know what I mean? If we think about the changes, even something really boring like fire prevention, the biggest changes for sprinklering happen when we had a tragedy.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And so we wait for the tragedy because we've always done it this way, Adam.
Yeah.
And there's no problem with this until there is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what happens is we don't have enough information yet to say that one program or one approach is better than any other.
Right.
And I don't know of many organizations that are running active testing to see what is the wellness level, what are my baselines, are they changing, are they up and down? Normally the response is, we offer this.
Okay.
That's what we offer our members.
Yeah.
I said, well, I don't say this, but your members are reaching out, so that's not good enough.
So is there something where they could change? Could they, like the other point of it is it's hard to coordinate all these different, if I want to do more than one at once, it's going to be hard to do that, right? Yeah. From an organizational standpoint. But like you were mentioning there, the analogy with the medicine, like Advil may work for your headache, but Tylenol works for me, right? So yes. How does that?
100%. And so I think that the thing is that we have to just offer different tools.
Right.
And so if I'm spending, if I'm a big department, I've got money to burn, right? Not really, they would disagree with me, but we've got income coming in, enough that we can outfit people. Mm-hmm. So then instead of outfitting everybody with one tool, we could outfit multiple people with different tools.
Right.
Right? And then I can, you're in peer work and I'm in, I'm into clinical work, and so we can band together and say, we can help this person, right? And so their flavor is peer work, and it's like, okay, so that's what you do then, and that's the work you do. And everybody gets that exposure piece. Now that might not be ideal, but it's, and I certainly don't pretend to have all of the answers. Yeah. Your point's a good one. I don't disagree with that either. I think that organizationally, however, in the fire services especially, but certainly probably in the other ones as well, what happens is that we grab onto one thing and that becomes our one thing.
Right.
And that flavors everything, and that makes it more difficult because we're banding on this one thing. And so having some flexibility in the organization, I think, is an important piece. A really important step towards doing that would be getting certainly getting a good group of peers, but then having a mental health professional who's well versed in the culture of that organization. I mean, and that goes from the big macro, so I'm well cultured in fire, all the way into I know these people, right? Okay. And this is what we kind of used to have. I mean, fire departments for sure, and still is the case. We have pastors, right? And now, spiritual things aside, we had somebody that we could go to for talking, right? Another interesting thing, way off topic, but still similar, is that we also used to have dogs, in the fire hall. And so when we talk about instances of trauma work and all of that piece, it's interesting for me to always reflect on the fact that we actually used to have an animal in the fire hall. And I wonder if we were to go back to look at the differences, what that might have looked like.
Yeah, because the firefighter could come back from a very traumatic call and have a cuddle with it, pet the dog. Oh, I'm just going to go for a walk with him. Yeah.
We do that mindfulness stuff. We move our body, right? Yeah. We're realigning our, mental and physical beings, right?
Yeah, for sure. So do you think that's one of the biggest keys that's missing is just kind of telling the first responder community that not every approach is going to work and you should try different approaches, and especially on a personal level, if that approach doesn't work for you, don't stop there. find something else.
Yeah, I think we're in a quagmire in some regrets as well, because that's 100% right. The problem being is that we don't have research for any of this stuff.
Yeah.
And so this is how you start a Twitter debate, right? Is you say that we need research for something, and then you get 1,000 people to tell you their struggles and why you can't wait, and they're not wrong, right? I mean, we're still having people dying of suicide, but they're not wrong. But anecdotes only take us so far, right? Anecdotes are a great thing for us to look at something.
Yeah.
So if I band together with 5 or 6 people and, you know, we don't drink, and instead what we do is we really hash out how we're feeling, and we talk about this emotionally, and I find out that you and I are both feeling hopeless, right? And then, you know, I feel really great after that, and so do you, and we go, this is a thing that we did, right? Then we recognize, so that anecdote suggests that if you and I relate and normalize our emotions, and I recognize that, you know, I'm not alone in this,
Right.
there's some benefit there. And then we come in with, you know, who I very lovingly call the eggheads, and they come in and they do the work to find out. And now we can convince those oh so smart money holders that this is worth investing in, right?
Yeah, you have the science to back it up.
And you need the numbers. I mean, people can fight you tooth and nail, but the fact of the matter is if we don't have the numbers, then anything can kind of float in.
Right.
And I think the first responder world does a very good job, and probably because of the work that they do, is kind of sniffing out the foo-foo from what'll work. And so why we haven't seen anything really odd coming in, I think we've seen things that the research will likely back up, and I'm confident in that. But I mean, the problem is we got to wait for it.
That's what I was just going to say. Yeah, you've got those anecdotes now. You've got that collection of personal stories. And now you're trying to get to the point where you figure out, research-wise, what actually happened to make you where you are today. But like you said, that doesn't take a day, it doesn't take a week, it doesn't take a month. It's going to take years and maybe a decade or more before we get the concrete evidence.
Yeah, and I mean, this is an area that I could definitely go on for hours on, because there's more layers to this, right? Because how, you know, as a news agency, how would you put out a research paper? Right? And I'm not speaking of you specifically, of course, but generally speaking, if I see a research paper come out, what's the headline typically say?
Yeah, it just says just what the research paper is about. New discovery on mental health.
Yes, right? Possible cure for, revolutionary thing, right? Whatever's going to get me to click and read that, right? And that's all of that aside, that's the necessary component for that model. And you're doing good work getting that message out.
Right.
But the problem is that the first responder world aren't researchers.
Right.
Not exclusively, right? There's research as part of it. And so then to go and actually look at that research and to look at it and see what it says, right? Then we recognize at the end is the most important, and a lot of times, right? That discussion piece where they start to talk about all of what they found and put it into like what I just call the things that I can understand words, right? And then they have the limitations at the end, and that's really important. Because that's where they hedge all the bets, and that's where the most important information will come from, because it says, you know, maybe our sample size isn't that great. Maybe this isn't generalized to all first responders. Maybe I've got a gender variability that's not going to say that says that we had more, you know, of one population and not enough of another to say that it'll be for both.
Or different ethnicities even.
Yeah, different cultures, all of that pieces, right? Like, and so that's the other important piece about the research is that I think that, and there's some great organizations out there, I think, that are doing fantastic job of making this literate for the first responder folk, but they're few and far between, and we need more of them, right? That able to communicate effectively with an organization to say, this is what we're finding, this is what that means, and this is what this is what we would suggest to move forward on.
Yeah, and so that's probably, then again, like you said, that's probably the biggest, we're in a waiting game almost at this point.
Yeah, we're in a holding pattern. But that's not to say that that's completely it either, right? So if we're open-minded enough, like I think that we have been, we start to find things like equine therapy that kind of come in, and we notice that there's help for that. Emotional support and therapy dogs are now a more common, more acceptance. We always see a story coming up about people learning the hard way about what that means for them or in their organizations, right? And yoga is a good one, different types of therapies, but I think the important piece is that open-mindedness piece.
Right, and willing to try different things.
100%.
If you're one person watching this and you're struggling, don't stop at the first thing. Don't stop at the second thing. Stop at what works for you.
And don't stop at the first therapist.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is the unfortunate part of this process. When you're the most vulnerable, it's the hardest to get out the door and look.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you know, the biggest therapy secret is the relationship. So if you don't like me, we're not going to get very far.
Yep.
We could still do work, right? We can still do work, but if you really are untrustworthy of me, if there's something about me that gives you a bad vibe, etc., you're not going to give me the full truth.
Yep.
Why would you? I'm already a stranger in a chair. Now I'm a stranger in a chair that's setting off your alarm bells.
Yeah.
So I think too, it's just recognizing that if you go to therapy and it doesn't work, you're not broken. There is help for you.
For sure.
And it's just that powering through piece that I make sound so easy, and I don't mean it to, because it's one of the hardest things people do. But I always tell folks that come in that the strongest people I know are the ones that sit in my chair.
Right.
Hands down, they're the strongest people I know, because they've been through hell.
Yeah.
And yet they come in and they tell me, and it's not the first time they went through that story, and it's not the first time that they've had to look at someone, and it's not the first time they sat in therapy. And I'm like, listen, like, you've got your, and they don't believe me when I tell them. Then that becomes my work, right? My overarching work is to, you know, for you to finally believe that you're strong.
Right. Well, they're strong enough, like you said, for getting in there and sharing. And then hopefully you can get them to the point where they're strong enough to turn around and share that with their community. Because once they show up and say, hey, I had this experience, I went and saw a therapist, I feel a lot better, then their other coworkers may go, hey, that may work for me.
100%, right? And with the first responder field, it is really about trust.
Yeah.
Right, and so, you know, something that works for Firefighter A, they'll go and tell Firefighter B, and they'll call and reach out. Right, and that's the thing, is that once you've built that trust, once you have somebody in there that has that trust, they can move mountains and they can do a lot of good work.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that information, Nick. And here's to moving forward and getting the research and getting more of the stigma broken down, right?
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you. Well, once again, thank you very much for joining me for the special documentary, Resiliency and Recovery. I hope you enjoyed the documentary. I certainly enjoyed talking about mental health with these professionals. I hope you gained some insight into the first responder world and mental health. And if you're a first responder yourself, I hope you picked up a few tips and tricks. Again, I want to thank you, Leslie Ford, for sponsoring this documentary, and Lisa for coming onto it to give some reasons why. And thank you to Deborah MacDonald and the first responders who were here presenting. Deborah was the organizer behind this whole thing, and she got the Invisible Wounds Conference doing, and she's done a lot of the work behind the scenes that you haven't seen. And her husband, Bruce MacDonald, for helping organize the logistics of this weekend and getting all the interviews together. Again, I'm Adam Mulliver, and thank you again to all the people who appeared in this documentary sharing their stories. It's very important that we all share our stories as we break down the stigma, and then we can all be resilient and recover from trauma. Thank you for joining me. The preceding program was brought to you by Whiteman TV and Bruce Telecom.